Imagine this. Your neighbor, the one who constantly nitpicks about the color of your mailbox or the length of your grass, suddenly decides she has the authority to enforce her own rules. That's exactly what happened in my neighborhood when our infamous HOA Karen set her sights on my Jeep. She thought it was an eyesore, claimed it violated community standards, and swore she'd deal with it herself. But here's the twist she didn't see coming. That Jeep wasn't just mine. It belonged to an active police task force, loaded with hidden surveillance equipment. One afternoon, fueled by arrogance and a pair of bolt cutters, Karen marched over, cut my lock, and tried to break into the Jeep. The second she touched that door, alarms and trackers went off. Within minutes, undercover officers swarmed the street. And there she was, caught red-handed, bolt cutters in hand, babbling about HOA rules while facing federal agents. She thought she was enforcing neighborhood policy. Instead, she triggered a police sting. And the fallout? Oh, trust me, it was something the whole neighborhood will never forget. I've always known my neighborhood had a certain reputation. Every lawn is perfectly trimmed, every driveway spotless, and every mailbox lined up like soldiers in uniform. The sidewalks are pressure washed weekly, flower beds rotate with the seasons, and even the holiday decorations are mandated by the HOA rulebook. Around here, the motto is, blend in or be called out. So you can imagine the stir when I parked my Jeep in my driveway one quiet Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't just any Jeep. It was rugged, tall, and armored in a way that didn't match the polished sedans and spotless SUVs scattered across the cul-de-sac. It looked like something that belonged on a military training ground, not in the middle of the suburb where arguments break out over the shade of beige you're allowed to paint your shutters. I noticed the moment I turned off the ignition. The curtains twitching across the street, the disapproving stares from neighbors watering their lawns. The Jeep stood out like a bruise on porcelain. But here's the thing. That Jeep wasn't really mine. Sure, I had the keys. Sure, it was parked in front of my house. But it belonged to a police task force, a specialized undercover unit that had loaned me the vehicle for an operation I was quietly involved in. I wasn't a cop, not officially, but I had ties, and in this case, they needed someone who could keep the Jeep in plain sight without raising suspicion. At least that was the plan. I leaned against a hood that afternoon, feeling the heat of the sun radiating through the black steel. To anyone else, it looked like an old off-road Jeep with some wear and tear. But I knew better. Inside, tucked beneath the dash in hidden compartments, was an array of equipment, tracking devices, cameras, even a mobile uplink connected to a secure line. It was bait in a much larger sting. And my neighborhood, with its polished smiles and secret resentments, was the perfect hiding place. The Jeep had only been there for a few hours when I started hearing the whispers. First, from Mrs. Green, the neighbor 3 doors down who couldn't walk her poodle without broadcasting neighborhood gossip like a podcast. It doesn't match the aesthetic. I overheard her hissing into her phone. It looks dangerous. Then from Mr. Lane, the self-appointed neighborhood watch captain, who left his garage door open just wide enough for me to see him peering out, binoculars in hand, notebook ready to document whatever crime against property values I had just committed, but none of them compared to her. Karen, every neighborhood has one, but ours had the one, middle-aged, sharp-eyed, with a permanent scowl that made you feel guilty even when you'd done nothing wrong. She was the type who knew every bylaw in the HOA handbook by heart and quoted them like scripture. She had filed complaints against kids for chalk drawings on sidewalks. She had measured lawns with a ruler. She once demanded a neighbor repaint his fence because the shade of white was too warm. And now, she had her eyes locked on my Jeep. I caught her that evening, standing on the edge of her driveway, arms crossed, lips pursed, glaring at it like it had personally insulted her. She marched over once, stopped short, then retreated, muttering something under her breath. I almost laughed. If only she knew what she was glaring at, because that Jeep wasn't just transportation. It was a chess piece in a much bigger game. A police operation designed to monitor certain individuals suspected of running contraband through suburban routes. The task force needed the Jeep visible, but unremarkable. They assumed my quiet, rule-abiding neighborhood would be the perfect cover. No one here asked questions. As long as your roses bloomed on schedule and your garbage cans weren't left out overnight, But the task force hadn't accounted for Karen. That night, as I stood in the kitchen sipping coffee, I caught the faint reflection of flashing lights on the Jeep's interior monitor. The equipment was live, transmitting data back to the unit. I felt a shiver of pride and unease. This was bigger than me. I was a placeholder, a guardian of sorts, keeping the Jeep safe until it served its purpose. I thought about how absurd it would sound to anyone else. Why is there a tactical surveillance Jeep parked in front of a suburban house with tulip beds and garden gnomes? No one could know, not my friends, not my neighbors, and definitely not Karen. But as the days passed, her obsession grew. She circled it in the mornings when she went out to collect her mail. She snapped pictures with her phone, probably emailing them to the HOA board with subject lines like Violation Report Number 237. I even caught her once bending slightly to peek at the lock I had placed on the Jeep, an extra precaution recommended by the task force. She didn't like that lock. Not one bit. I knew what was coming. I could feel it building, like the slow rumble of a storm far off in the distance. With every passing day, Karen's frustration grew until it was no longer about a Jeep or a lock. It was about control. In her mind, the neighborhood was her kingdom, and the Jeep was an intruder she could not tolerate. The irony, of course, was brutal. The more she saw it as a threat to her suburban order, the more she drew closer to a vehicle wired to alert law enforcement at the slightest interference. I remember standing on my porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the rooftops, casting long shadows across the Jeep. I thought about the line between normal life and hidden operations, how thin and fragile it really was. To the neighbors, it was just an ugly Jeep. To Karen, it was a symbol of defiance. To the police task force, it was a tool in a high-stakes game. And to me, it was a secret I had to guard, knowing full well it was only a matter of time before curiosity and arrogance collided and someone got burned. Because Karen wasn't the type to write endless complaint letters and stop there. She was the type to act. And the day she did, she'd have no idea what kind of hornet's nest she was about to crack open. It didn't take long before the paper trail started. The first note appeared on a Wednesday morning, neatly tucked under the Jeep's wiper blade. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate, almost aggressive in its neatness. Every letter pressed like she wanted the ink to stab to the page. Notice of violation. Vehicle lock and overall appearance violate HOA community standards. This Jeep is an eyesore and must be removed immediately. She even underlined immediately. Twice. I plucked it off, folded it in half, and stuffed it in my pocket. My plan was simple. Ignore her. The task force had already warned me that locals might get curious about the Jeep, and the less I engaged, the better. But Karen wasn't the type to stop at one note. The next morning, another appeared. This one had more flair. Your vehicle's external lock is not approved. It looks unsafe, unprofessional, and lowers property values. Failure to comply will result in formal fines. I chuckled as I read it. Unsafe? The irony wasn't lost on me. If she knew what was inside that Jeep, surveillance gear, encrypted uplinks, and federal-grade tracking tech, she wouldn't be worried about the lock. She'd be worried about the fact that tampering with it could put her on a federal watch list. But Karen thrived on imagined authority. She didn't just write notes. She turned them into performances. By the third day, I caught her in the act. Standing in the middle of the street with her phone angled just so, she snapped pictures of the Jeep from every angle, muttering to herself as she circled it like a shark. She crouched to photograph the lock, zoomed in on the tires, even tried to catch reflections through the tinted glass. When she noticed me watching from the porch, she straightened, puffed up her chest, and marched halfway up my driveway. Just so you know, she announced, her voice sharp as broken glass. This vehicle is in violation of Section 4, Subsection C of the HOA Handbook. We do not permit unsightly hardware or unauthorized modifications. I sipped my coffee, deliberately calm. Good morning, Karen. Don't good morning me, she snapped, waving her phone like it was a badge. I've already filed complaint with the HOA board. If this isn't removed, you'll be fined. I wanted to laugh. Fines. If only she knew the kind of fine she was flirting with. Federal, not HOA. But I stayed quiet, nodding like I'd taken her seriously. Because the truth was, The more noise she made, the closer she crept to disaster. By the end of the week, the Jeep had become the neighborhood's favorite spectacle. Kids on bikes whispered about it like it was a monster truck. One boy swore he saw wires glowing inside, which wasn't far from the truth. Retirees walking their dogs shook their heads, muttering that it just didn't belong here. And Karen? She fed off the attention like fuel. Her notes escalated in tone. Last warning. The lock is not permitted. If you do not remove it, further action will be taken. Unsafe vehicle observed again. This will be reported. HOA fines will be enforced. Community safety comes first. Your Jeep compromises it. Each note grew bolder, more dramatic. One even had an attached printout. She had gone home, typed her complaint, and returned to stick it under the wiper like it was a legal summons. The neighbors, however, had grown tired. "Karen, it's just a car," muttered Mr. Lane, who usually agreed with her. "You're making a scene." Mrs. Green, who adored gossip but hated confrontation, rolled her eyes so hard I thought they'd get stuck. "Leave it, Karen. No one cares but you." But that was the problem. When Karen felt ignored, she doubled down. One afternoon, I stepped outside to see her standing only inches from the Jeep, a yellow tape measure stretched across the lock. She scribbled numbers onto a clipboard, shaking her head with exaggerated disapproval. "Illegal dimensions," she muttered loudly, making sure I could hear. This is going straight into the report. I almost asked her what the legal dimensions of a Jeep lock were, but I bit my tongue. Let her play sheriff. The more she pushed, the closer she got to triggering something much bigger than her HOA handbook. The irony was breathtaking. Karen thought she was defending the community from an unsafe lock. In reality, she was circling an active police asset, one wide with alarms and trackers designed to catch criminals in the act of tampering. Every time she touched that Jeep, she was dancing on a tripwire she couldn't see. The neighborhood began to split. Some sided with her, those who feared her wrath more than they cared about the Jeep. "Maybe you should just move it," whispered one nervous neighbor, eyes darting toward Karen's house as if she might be listening. "It's not worth the headache." Others openly mocked her. "What's she gonna do? Write the Jeep a parking ticket?" Laughed a teenager, riding past as Karen photographed the tires for the 5th time. But Karen wasn't laughing. Her face grew tighter, her notes more threatening. She wasn't content with empty warnings anymore. She wanted action, and that was when she crossed the line. It happened on a Friday afternoon, the kind of day when the air feels heavy and restless, like the neighborhood itself is waiting for something to snap. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the cul-de-sac, and most folks had retreated indoors to the hum of air conditioners and the smell of dinner cooking. But not Karen. I noticed her the moment she stepped out of her house. She wasn't carrying her usual clipboard or camera this time. No passive-aggressive notes, no tape measure. Instead, she carried something heavier, something that gleamed under the sunlight, a pair of industrial-sized bolt cutters. The sight was almost surreal. Karen, in her pastel cardigan and sensible sneakers, striding down her driveway like a soldier going to war, muttering under her breath as she marched toward the Jeep. "This neighborhood has standards," she hissed, "and I'm not going to let one selfish person ruin it for everyone." Her words carried in the quiet evening. The few neighbors who happened to be outside froze, unsure if they should intervene or just watch the spectacle unfold. Mrs. Green clutched her poodle tighter, whispering, "Oh, dear Lord," while Mr. Lane peeked out from his garage, scribbling something in his notebook. Karen didn't care. She was on a mission. I watched from my front window, my heart pounding. The task force had warned me about interference, but even they hadn't predicted this level of audacity. She wasn't just filing complaints anymore. She was about to physically tamper with an active undercover vehicle. She reached the Jeep, planted her feet wide, and positioned the bolt cutters against the thick steel lock I'd secured to the driver's side. Her face was twisted in determination, lips pursed, brows furrowed, sweat beading at her temples. With a grunt, she clamped down. Snap! The lock gave way with a metallic crack, falling to the driveway with a heavy clang that echoed through the street. It was the sound of a boundary shattering, The invisible line between petty HOA meddling and real crime. Karen didn't flinch. She tossed the broken lock aside like trash and grabbed the Jeep's handle. "Time to clean up this mess," she declared, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "We'll have this thing towed before sundown." But the second she yanked the door open, the Jeep awakened. It started subtle. A faint click beneath the dashboard, a tiny red light blinking alive on the console. Then came the surge of sound, a sharp, piercing alarm that split the suburban quiet like a siren at crime scene. Hidden trackers inside the Jeep lit up simultaneously, sending encrypted signals racing across invisible networks to the task force command center miles away. Karen stumbled back, startled, but not enough to stop her. "What on earth?" she muttered, covering her ears against the shrill alarm. The neighbors gasped. Curtains fluttered as more faces appeared in windows. Children ran from their bikes to their porches. The quiet cul-de-sac had transformed into a stage, and Karen was center spotlight, bolt cutters still dangling from her hand. And the show wasn't over. Within moments, the alarm triggered a cascade of responses. The Jeep's headlights flashed wildly, horn blaring in bursts, while the internal uplink relayed a simple but urgent message to the task force. "Vehicle tampered. Send units immediately." I could almost imagine the officers on the other end springing into action, radios crackling, agents suiting up, unmarked vehicles roaring to life. Karen, meanwhile, was flustered but still defiant. She shoved the door again, shouting over the alarm. "This vehicle is unsafe. It doesn't belong here. I'm doing everyone a favor." Her words sounded hollow now, drowned out by the shriek of alarms and the growing murmur of neighbors gathering at a distance. Nobody moved to support her. Even those who once nodded at her crusades were now backing away, eyes wide. It didn't take long. 5 minutes, maybe less. That's all the task force needed. The first black SUV tore into the neighborhood like thunder, tires screeching as it stopped directly behind the Jeep. Then another, and another. Within moments, the peaceful cul-de-sac was crawling with undercover agents spilling out of vehicles, guns holstered but hands ready, tactical vests glinting with federal insignia. Karen froze, bolt cutters still in her grip, her face drained of color as two officers closed in on her, their voices firm and authoritative. "Step away from the vehicle, ma'am. Drop the cutters." "I what?" "No, this is a violation of HOA rules." Karen stammered, waving the cutters in protest. "This car was locked illegally. I was correcting the problem." The agents exchanged a look, half disbelief, half irritation. "Ma'am," one said slowly, "you've just tampered with a federal task force vehicle. This is a criminal offense." The words hit like a sledgehammer. The neighbors gasped audibly. Mrs. Green covered her mouth. Mr. Lane's pen fell from his notebook. Karen, however, doubled down. "No, you don't understand. This is my neighborhood. I enforce the rules here. That Jeep was unsafe. I was protecting the community." The officer didn't blink. "Ma'am, put the cutters down. Now." Her hands trembled. The bolt cutters slipped from her grasp and clattered onto the pavement. For the first time since I'd known her, Karen looked small, deflated, cornered, powerless. The agents moved in, securing the Jeep, scanning its equipment, confirming the alarm logs. Others questioned me, confirming I was the registered caretaker of the vehicle. And all the while, Karen stood surrounded, sputtering excuses that no one wanted to hear. HOA rules don't override federal law. One officer finally told her, his voice low and final. It was over. In less than 10 minutes. Karen had transformed from self-appointed enforcer of petty neighborhood laws to a suspect caught tampering with federal property. And the fallout was only just beginning. The street had never seen anything like it. One moment, the quiet of the cul-de-sac was broken only by the shrill wail of the Jeep's hidden alarm. The next, it was chaos. Black SUVs with tinted windows screeching to a halt, tires leaving fresh rubber streaks across the pristine pavement. Doors flew open and out poured men and women in tactical vests, radios crackling, hands resting near their sidearms. The neighbors poured out like moths to a flame. Curtains were yanked aside, porches filled with gawkers, cell phones lifted high to record what would soon be the most talked about moment in the history of their HOA. And in the center of it all stood Karen. Her pastel cardigan looked almost comical against the backdrop of armored agents. She still clutched the bolt cutters in one hand, knuckles white, face frozen between outrage and panic. The broken lock lay at her feet like damning evidence. Two officers advanced quickly, their movements sharp but controlled. One barked in a voice that cut through the noise. "Ma'am, drop the cutters. Step away from the vehicle. Now!" Karen blinked, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. She looked down at the bolt cutters, then back at the Jeep, as if only now realizing she was caught in something far bigger than an HOA violation. "I what? No, you don't understand," she sputtered, her voice cracking. "This Jeep was illegally parked. It violated community standards. I was—" "Ma'am." The officer's tone hardened. "You are interfering with federal property. Put the cutters down." The words federal property rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Neighbors gasped. Whispers exploded into frantic chatter. Mrs. Green nearly dropped her poodle. Mr. Lane's notebook slipped from his hands. Even the teenagers who had been smirking at Karen's antics earlier fell silent, eyes wide as they recorded every second on their phones. Karen's jaw trembled. She loosened her grip, and the bolt cutters clattered loudly against the driveway. "Good," the officer said, signaling another agent to move in. "Step back with your hands where we can see them." Karen complied, stiff and jerky, her arms raised awkwardly above her shoulders. Her eyes darted to crowded neighbors, as if searching for sympathy, but all she saw were wide eyes and shaking heads. "Please," she tried again, desperation bleeding into her voice. "I was only enforcing the rules. This vehicle had an unauthorized lock. It was lowering property values, and—" "Ma'am," the second officer interrupted firmly, "you just committed a felony. This isn't about property values. This is an active task force operation." Her knees seemed to buckle slightly. "Task force? But it's just a Jeep. It's ugly. It doesn't belong here." From the back of the crowd, someone finally shouted what everyone else was thinking. "It doesn't belong here? Neither do bolt cutters, Karen." Laughter rippled through the audience, sharp and unforgiving. Karen's face flushed red, then pale, then red again. She tried to recover her composure. "You don't understand. The HOA handbook clearly states—" "Ma'am." The officer cut her off with a tone of finality. "HOA rules don't override federal law. You've tampered with government property. That's a serious crime." The weight of the words seemed to crush her. For years, Karen had thrived on being the self-appointed enforcer of petty rules. But in this moment, her power evaporated. She wasn't the hunter anymore. She was prey, cornered under the unblinking eyes of the entire neighborhood. The agents moved past her, swarming the Jeep. They checked the equipment, scanned the hidden trackers, logged the alarm trigger. Radios crackled with confirmation. The system had worked exactly as designed. The bait had been tampered with, and the response had been immediate. Meanwhile, two officers remained with Karen, keeping her from bolting back to her house. She stood frozen, muttering weak protests. "This is all a misunderstanding. I was protecting the neighborhood. The lock was unsafe." Her excuses grew smaller with each attempt. The more she spoke, the more absurd she sounded, especially against a backdrop of flashing tactical gear and federal agents. The neighbors whispered mercilessly. "Can you believe this? She thought she could tow a federal Jeep. I told you she'd go too far one day. Unbelievable. All that over a lock." I stayed silent on my porch, coffee mug trembling slightly in my hand. Part of me wanted to step in to explain, but the task force had been clear. "Stay out of it. Let's handle it." So I watched as Karen's world unraveled in front of everyone. Finally, one officer addressed the gathering crowd, his voice amplified with authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your homes. This is an active federal matter. There is no danger to the public at this time." But no one moved. Phones continued recording. Eyes continued staring. For once, Karen wasn't the one doing the shaming. She was the one being publicly dismantled. "Please," she cried suddenly, turning to the officer nearest her. "You don't understand. I was only trying to enforce order. This neighborhood has rules. Without rules, there's chaos." The officer gave her a long, measured look. "Ma'am, the only chaos here is the one you created." The words landed like a gavel. Karen's shoulders slumped, her head bowed. The bolt cutters lay at her feet, the broken lock beside them. Symbols of arrogance and downfall. It was almost poetic. For years, she had claimed to protect the neighborhood. But in the end, it wasn't vandals or burglars or strangers she had exposed. It was herself. And the neighborhood would never forget it. The aftermath was swift, public, and unforgettable. Within hours of the incident, Karen's carefully cultivated image of authority collapsed like a house of cards. Federal officers didn't just let her off with a warning. They processed her right there in the middle of the cul-de-sac. The neighbors watched in stunned silence as she was questioned, her statements scribbled down, her excuses cataloged, and her face photographed for the official report. The charges were serious. Property damage, tampering with police equipment, and obstruction of justice. Even the phrasing sounded like a hammer dropping. It was more than a slap on the wrist. It was the kind of list that followed you into courtrooms, employment background checks, and whispered conversations in grocery stores. Karen sputtered through every step, her voice shaking, desperate to spin the story back into her favor. "This is a misunderstanding. I was following HOA rules. I was trying to protect the community." But her protest sounded thin, hollow, and pathetic against the weight of the law. The officers were polite, but unyielding. No one was interested in the HOA handbook anymore. By the next morning, the whole neighborhood knew. Word spread faster than the alarm had. Phones buzzed, social media posts circulated, and even local news stations caught wind of the story. HOA resident caught tampering with federal vehicle was the kind of headline that practically wrote itself. The HOA board scrambled to distance themselves. They released a stiffly worded statement, printed in all caps on the community bulletin, and emailed to every resident. The board of directors does not condone nor support the individual actions of residents who interfere with property not belonging to them. The HOA had no knowledge of nor involvement in the incident that occurred on date. In plain English, they had thrown Karen to the wolves. For years, they had tolerated her self-appointed crusades because she saved them the effort of enforcing petty rules. But now, she was toxic, an embarrassment too big to sweep under the rug. The community itself was a mixture of relief, disbelief, and glee. Mrs. Green, clutching her poodle on her morning walk, muttered, "I always knew she'd take it too far." Mr. Lane, usually her ally, shook his head as he watered his lawn. She thought she was above everyone else. Turns out, she's not even above the law. The teenagers were less diplomatic. They circulated memes of Karen wielding bolt cutters, superimposed with captions like Karen versus the feds, round one. Even the more sympathetic neighbors couldn't resist gossiping. "Did you hear? They said the Jeep was part of the sting operation. Federal property. Can you imagine? She's lucky she didn't end up in handcuffs on the evening news." I stayed quiet, as instructed by the task force. My role had been small, just a caretaker of the Jeep, but now I felt like a witness to a morality play. Watching Karen unravel was almost surreal. She had always carried herself like a queen among peasants, wielding HOA rules like a sword. But now she was dethroned, exposed, and powerless. The irony wasn't lost on me. She thought she was defending the community from a lock, a Jeep, a minor violation. But in reality, she had stumbled headfirst into a federal operation, her arrogance turning a simple nuisance into a criminal case. She hadn't been protecting the neighborhood. She had endangered it. For weeks afterward, Karen all but vanished. The woman who once patrolled the sidewalks with her clipboard was suddenly nowhere to be seen. No more notes tucked under windshield wipers. No more pictures snapped from across the street. No more loud arguments about the shade of someone's shutters. When she did appear, she was smaller somehow. Shoulders hunched, eyes cast downward, always in a hurry to scuttle back inside before anyone could stop her. If she passed someone on the street, she avoided eye contact. Gone was the piercing glare that once made children drop their sidewalk chalk. And the Jeep? It remained exactly where it was, parked in my driveway, humming quietly with its hidden equipment. Karen never so much as glanced at it again. The neighborhood learned something too. For years, people had tolerated Karen because it was easier than fighting her, easier to repaint the fence than argue, easier to mow the lawn twice a week than receive endless violation notices. But now, the spell was broken. She wasn't the enforcer anymore. She wasn't untouchable. She was just another neighbor, one who had been humiliated in front of everyone. And every time I walked past a Jeep, I couldn't help but smile at the thought. Karen had wanted to enforce order, but in doing so, she had exposed the fragility of her own authority. The Jeep stayed until the task force declared the operation complete. One morning, the same SUVs returned, quiet this time, efficient. The Jeep was driven away without fanfare, its mission accomplished. For the neighbors, it was just a mysterious vehicle that came and went. For Karen, it was the ghost of her downfall. As for me, I often reflected on the strange chain of events. One rugged Jeep, one overzealous neighbor, and suddenly the entire neighborhood had been forced to confront the difference between rules and laws, authority and arrogance, order and chaos. Karen had always preached about protecting the community, but in the end, the community was only truly protected when someone finally stopped her. And from that day forward, whenever I saw her scurrying back to her house, avoiding every glance, I thought to myself, that's the price of mistaking power for righteousness. That's the cost of being Karen.